Part 1. I boarded the 11:45 p.m. train from Chicago heading towards Denver. It was supposed to be an uneventful overnight journey, a cheap way to visit my brother for the holidays. The train was mostly empty, except for a few other passengers scattered throughout the car. I chose a window seat in the middle of the car, eager to zone out with some music and watch the Midwest blur by in the dark. A man in a worn trench coat shuffled past me and sat 2 rows ahead. He carried an old briefcase that looked like it had seen better days, and his face was obscured by a battered fedora. The train lurched forward, and the lights overhead flickered briefly as we began to move. I glanced around at the other passengers. Behind me, a woman clutched a child close to her chest, whispering something soothing to the little girl who seemed restless. Across the aisle, a young couple was engaged in quiet conversation, their voices blending with the steady rhythm of the train. It wasn't until we left the last Chicago suburb behind that I noticed something strange. The man in the trench coat hadn't moved since he sat down. He was perfectly still, his head slightly tilted towards the window, as if gazing into the void. I dismissed it at first, assuming he was just lost in thought, but then, the whispers started. It wasn't the woman behind me, nor was it the couple across the aisle. These whispers seemed to come from nowhere, threading through the air like smoke. I looked around, trying to pinpoint their source, but everyone else seemed oblivious. Even the woman with the child had drifted off to sleep. The whispers grew louder, taking on an urgent, almost pleading tone. I leaned forward slightly, focusing on the man in the trench coat. He hadn't moved, but I could see his shoulders rise and fall slightly, as though he was breathing in short, shallow gasps. And then, just as the train entered a dark tunnel, he turned his head sharply and looked straight at me. His face, God, his face, wasn't right. I froze under his stare, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. His face was pale, almost waxy, like it belonged to a mannequin rather than a man. His eyes, if they were eyes, seemed too dark, like bottomless pits that drank in the dim train lights and gave nothing back. I wanted to break eye contact, but I couldn't. It was as if those empty sockets were pulling me in, like a drowning swimmer caught in an undertow. Just when I thought I'd lose myself completely, the train burst out of the tunnel, and the lights flickered back to life. He turned away as if nothing had happened, settling back into his eerie stillness. I gasped for air, realizing I'd been holding my breath. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Sleep deprivation. An overactive imagination. Surely, there had to be something logical. I turned around to see if anyone else had noticed, but the woman and her child were still sound asleep, and the couple across the aisle seemed utterly engrossed in their conversation. It was as though I was the only one aware that something was wrong. I decided to switch cars. It was probably irrational, but being so close to that man was unbearable. I grabbed my backpack, slid into the aisle, and walked briskly toward the door at the end of the car. The door hissed as it opened, and I stepped into the narrow connector between the cars. The sound of the train's wheels on the tracks was deafening here, and the cold night air stung my face through the cracks in the seals. I pushed open the next door and stepped into another car. This one was emptier than the last, just a handful of passengers dozing in their seats. It felt better somehow, less oppressive. I took a seat near the back and let out a shaky breath, but my relief didn't last long. A few minutes later, the whispers returned. They were louder this time, and they felt closer, like a breath against my ear. I turned sharply, expecting to see someone standing behind me. But the car was still, its passengers oblivious, slumped in sleep or staring out the windows at the inky blackness outside. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw him again. The man in the trench coat was sitting at the very front of the car, 2 rows away from the door I had just entered through. There was no way he could have gotten past me. My breath caught in my throat. He was sitting perfectly still, his hat pulled low, but I knew it was him. That same trench coat. That same eerie stillness that I considered confronting him, demanding to know who he was and why he was following me, but fear pinned me to my seat. I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe there were 2 men in trench coats, or maybe I had overlooked him walking past me, but deep down, I knew the truth that I clutched the armrest tightly, my knuckles turning white. My gaze flicked to the other passengers, hoping one of them would notice, would react, would do something. But they remained oblivious, their heads lolling with the gentle rocking of the train. The whispers intensified, drowning out the rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks. They weren't just whispers anymore, they were voices, many voices, speaking over each other in a cacophony of languages I couldn't understand, and then, the lights went out, the train was plunged into complete darkness. A few startled gasps came from the passengers around me, but they were quickly swallowed by the oppressive black. I fumbled for my phone, desperate for some kind of light, but before I could grab it, the train lurched violently to a stop that I was thrown forward, hitting my head against the seat in front of me. Pain blossomed across my forehead, but I ignored it as I scrambled to my feet. The whispers were louder now, a deafening roar that seemed to come from every direction. The emergency lights flickered on, bathing the car in an unsettling red glow. That's when I saw them, figures, dozens of them, lined the aisle and pressed against the windows. Their forms were hazy, like smoke trapped in human shape. Their faces were indistinct, shifting like static on an old TV screen. But their eyes were clear. Dark, hollow voids that burned with malevolence, and at the center of it all stood the man in the trench coat. That he turned to face me, his head tilting at an unnatural angle, and raised a hand to point directly at me. The voices rose to a deafening crescendo, and my vision blurred. My knees buckled, and I collapsed to the floor, my body trembling uncontrollably. Then, everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, I was still on the train, but the car was empty. The lights were back on, and the train was moving smoothly along the tracks. That I stumbled to my feet, my heart racing. I rushed through the cars, searching for anyone, another passenger, a conductor, anyone who could explain what had just happened. But the train was deserted. Finally, I reached the front of the train, where I found the conductor's cabin. The door was ajar, and I pushed it open, desperate for answers. The cabin was empty, the train was speeding along, but there was no one at the controls. Outside, the landscape was unfamiliar, an endless expanse of barren desert stretching out under a sky filled with swirling, unnatural colors. That I realized then that the train wasn't going to Denver. That it wasn't going anywhere. I knew that it wasn't going to let me off. Part 2. She moved down the aisle with a slow, deliberate pace. Each step was eerily silent, her feet gliding across the floor as if they barely touched it. I wanted to look away, to bury my face in my hands and pretend she wasn't there, but I couldn't. Her blank, stone-like eyes locked onto mine, and a twisted grin began to spread across her too wide mouth. "Are you cold?" she asked. Her voice was a whisper, yet it cut through the silence of the car like a knife. I couldn't answer. My throat felt constricted, and my tongue was useless. She leaned closer, her head tilting unnaturally far to one side. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her grin widening. Behind her, the other passengers began to stir. But something was wrong. They moved in unison, their heads snapping upright and their bodies jerking into stiff, unnatural postures. Their faces were blank, their eyes unfocused, and they all turned toward me in perfect synchronization. The man across the aisle opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out, just a low, guttural moan that made my stomach churn. I was surrounded. I bolted from my seat, shoving past the woman as I ran toward the back of the car. Her grin never faltered, and I could hear her humming starting again, faint but growing louder with each step I took. The door at the end of the car wouldn't open. I yanked at it desperately, but it was locked, sealed tight. I turned back to see the passengers rising from their seats, their movements jerky and mechanical as they began to follow me. The humming was deafening now, reverberating through the car like the rumble of an approaching storm. And then, all at once, it stopped. The train lights flickered and went out, plunging the car into pitch-black darkness. I could hear movement all around me, shuffling feet, the creak of seats, and something else, breathing. It was close. A hand clamped down on my shoulder, ice-cold and unyielding. I screamed and twisted away, falling to the floor. My fingers scrambled for anything I could use as a weapon, but all I found was the smooth metal of the train's floor. The lights flickered back on. I was alone. The car was completely empty, no woman, no passengers, not even my belongings. It was as though I had imagined it all. The train began to move again, a jolt sending me sprawling to the floor. Outside, the dark countryside sped by, and the hum of the engine returned to fill the silence. When the train finally pulled into Boston, I stumbled out onto the platform, gasping for fresh air. I looked back at the car, expecting to see someone, anyone, watching me from the windows. But the car was dark, its windows opaque, as if it had never been occupied. I never found out what happened that night. I don't take trains anymore, and I avoid traveling alone after dark. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed, I hear it, a faint, dissonant hum, drifting through the quiet like a ghost of that endless ride. Part 3. I've always loved trains, even as a kid. The rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks, the low, mournful sound of the whistle, it all felt timeless. So, when I got a job working as a signal operator at an old, disused rail station, I jumped at the chance. The station was perched on the edge of a small town, surrounded by thick woods and long-forgotten rail lines. Most of my job involved monitoring a few active tracks that passed nearby, ensuring the signals worked properly and occasionally guiding freight trains through. The station itself was ancient, with peeling paint and rusted fixtures. It hadn't served passengers in decades, and most of the building was abandoned. My workspace was a small room on the second floor, overlooking the tracks below. It was on my third night shift that things started to go wrong. The first sign was the light. Around 2 a.m., the signal for track 6 started to flicker. It wasn't a track we used anymore, just an overgrown line that disappeared into the woods, but the light was connected to the same system as the active signals, and it shouldn't have been malfunctioning. I made a note to check the wiring in the morning and reset the system from my console. For a moment, the light stayed steady, glowing faintly in the distance, but then, as I watched, it turned red. My heart skipped a beat. The signal for track 6 wasn't supposed to change, it was always set to inactive. Yet there it was, glowing a bright, ominous red in the darkness. I leaned closer to the window, trying to get a better look. The woods beyond the station were shrouded in fog, and the faint glow of the signal cast eerie shadows across the trees, and then I saw it. A light was moving down the track. At first, I thought it was a train. The glow was faint, like the headlamp of an old engine, and it swayed slightly as it approached. But as it drew closer, I realized something was off. There was no sound, no rumble of wheels, no whistle, not even the faint hum of machinery, just the light, bobbing closer and closer. I stared at the light, transfixed. It moved with a steady, rhythmic sway, as if mimicking the motion of a train, but the silence was deafening that I grabbed my flashlight and ran down the stairs to the platform. If there really was an engine on track 6, it shouldn't have been there. The line was decommissioned decades ago, its rails rusted and warped, and no train could pass through safely. As I stepped onto the platform, the fog seemed to thicken, swallowing the faint moonlight. The glow of the signal cast an eerie red hue over everything, painting the scene like a nightmare. The light on the track was closer now, about 50 yards away, and I could just make out a shape behind it. My stomach turned as I realized it wasn't a train at all. It was a man. That he was carrying an old railway lantern, the kind you'd see in black and white photos. His figure was gaunt and hunched, and he walked with a slow, deliberate pace, his head bowed low. "Hey!" I called out, my voice echoing into the emptiness. "You're not supposed to be here." The man didn't respond. He didn't stop or even look up. He just kept walking, his lantern swaying in time with his steps. That I stepped closer to the edge of the platform, shining my flashlight down the track. "Sir, this line is closed. You need to get off the tracks, it's dangerous." Still, he didn't react. Then, just as he reached the base of the platform, he stopped. For a moment, everything was still. The fog seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with an unnatural silence. Slowly, the man lifted his head. His face, if you could call it that, was hollow, like the crumbling remains of an ancient mask. Empty eye sockets stared back at me, and his mouth was a jagged void, twisted into something between a scream and a grin. The lantern flickered, and I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. "Leave this place," the figure rasped, its voice a low, guttural whisper that seemed to seep into my bones. The light of the lantern dimmed, then flared bright, forcing me to shield my eyes. When I looked again, the man was gone. The signal for track 6 turned green. For several minutes, I stood frozen on the platform, staring at the empty tracks. The signal for track 6 still glowed green, its eerie light cutting through the fog like an unspoken invitation. That I should have gone back upstairs, locked the doors, and waited for dawn, but something compelled me to stay. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the lingering echo of that rasping voice. Either way, I found myself stepping off the platform and onto the tracks. The ground beneath my feet felt colder than it should have been, and the air seemed unnaturally still, as if the forest around me were holding its breath. I followed the track, my flashlight beam flickering as though the battery were dying. The fog thickened the further I went, swallowing the world around me until the station behind me disappeared entirely. All that remained was the narrow path of the rails stretching into the void. And then, I heard it started as a low rumble, so faint I thought it might be my imagination. But it grew louder with each step I took, the unmistakable sound of wheels grinding against steel. That I stopped dead in my tracks, shining my flashlight ahead. The beam caught movement in the distance, a glint of metal, a flash of light, and the faint outline of a train barreling toward me. But there was something wrong. The train didn't belong here. Its engine was ancient, a rusted relic belching thick black smoke that hung in the air like a storm cloud. The cars behind it were mismatched and decayed, their windows dark and shattered. It wasn't slowing down. That I stepped off the tracks, my heart hammering as the monstrous train roared past me. The air was filled with a deafening cacophony of screeching metal and ghostly whispers that seemed to rise from the very walls of the cars, and inside, through the broken windows, I saw them, faces, pale, hollow-eyed faces pressed against the glass, their mouths opening and closing as though they were screaming, though I couldn't hear a sound. They stared out at me, their expressions frozen in an eternal mix of terror and despair. One of them raised a hand, pressing it against the window as the train sped by. For a brief moment, I locked eyes with him, a young man in a tattered uniform, his gaze filled with pleading. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the train vanished into the fog, leaving behind only silence. That I stood there, trembling, trying to process what I'd just seen. But before I could gather my thoughts, the ground beneath me trembled. Another rumble filled the air. A second train was coming. This one was different, newer, but just as out of place. Its sleek, modern cars reflected the faint glow of the signal, and its headlights pierced through the fog like twin suns. As it approached, I realized it wasn't slowing down. It wasn't stopping for me, or anyone. I threw myself to the side, landing hard on the rocky embankment as the train roared past. Unlike the ghostly relic before it, this train was full of life. Through the windows, I saw passengers laughing, chatting, oblivious to the world outside. And then, just as the last car passed, it screeched to a halt, the doors slid open, and a figure stepped out. It was the man with the lantern. He didn't look at me this time. Instead, he turned toward the train, raising his lantern high. The passengers inside froze, their movements ceasing as if someone had pressed pause on their lives. Then the man spoke. "You've all taken the wrong train," he said, his voice echoing through the fog like a funeral bell. "It's time to disembark." One by one, the passengers rose from their seats and stepped off the train. They didn't look confused or frightened, they moved with a dreamlike calm, as though obeying some unseen force. As they filed onto the platform, their forms began to change. Their vibrant clothes faded into gray, their faces grew pale and gaunt, and their eyes darkened into empty voids. I realized, with a sickening jolt, that they were becoming like the passengers from the first train. The ghostly faces pressed against the glass. When the last passenger had stepped off, the man with the lantern turned to me. "Leave," he said simply, his hollow gaze locking onto mine. I didn't need to be told twice. I stumbled back along the tracks, the fog parting just enough to guide my way. When I finally reached the station, the signal for track 6 was dark. The air was silent, and the woods were still. I quit the job the next morning. This day, I don't know what I saw out there. Some nights, I dream about the trains, the ancient engine with its mournful passengers, the sleek, modern cars that carried unsuspecting souls to their fate. And sometimes, just before I wake, I hear the faint sound of a lantern swinging in the distance, its hollow light searching for the next wayward traveler to guide onto the wrong tracks.